Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Two momentous events have occurred in the national security space that have received nowhere near enough coverage in this country because they dramatically affect our security outlook. The first is US President Donald Trump throwing Ukraine under the bus, saying that it was Ukraine that invaded Russia, and a number of other features, and make no mistake, if Ukraine can be abandoned, then so can Australia. This is just a fact of life, and if anyone thinks otherwise, they are deluding themselves. The second major event was the Chinese Navy conducting live-fire drills in the Tasman Sea. Both of these events have enormous consequences for Australian security and implications for AUKUS Pillar 1. So let's have a look at both, starting with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Europe is in complete uproar about being abandoned by the US. Australia should be in a similar state of concern. I don't like being hyperbolic, but this is a fundamental shift in our security outlook, with the United States basically showing its willingness to wash its hands of any country on earth. What do we get here? Well, very little. Our politicians are still scared of saying anything at all that runs the likelihood or even the remote possibility of offending the United States. Apart from the generally outrageous nature of all of Trump's comments, such as Ukraine President Zelensky being a dictator, he was voted into office in free and fair elections, let's have a look at a specific US demand, namely that Ukraine sign over 50% of their rare earth minerals to the US. This is outrageous gangsterism. This is extortion that is probably against US law. Apparently, a piece of paper was put in front of Zelensky by a US negotiator saying he had an hour to sign. And when he declined to do so, Trump apparently went totally berserk. And by the way, this demand for 50% of the rare earth minerals, that's only for equipment that the US has delivered to date. It doesn't have anything to do with future security. Now, it's worth remembering, of course, that Presidents Trump and Zelensky have a bit of history. Trump's first impeachment, that he was threatening to withhold US weapons from Ukraine unless Zelensky digged up dirt on Hunter Biden, which he refused to do. And now, I'm not usually a fan of megaphone diplomacy, especially when you're dealing with Trump and his cronies, but surely we have reached a point when the Prime Minister or Defence Minister can politely, publicly disagree. The way to do it is to say something like, the US demand for Ukraine's resources is not only illegal, it's targeting the wrong country. We all know that it was Russia that launched completely unprovoked, hugely destructive attack on Ukraine. And if the US really wants access to critical minerals, then they should come from Russia, not from Ukraine. And I'd use these words, President Trump might be better off using his amazing negotiating skills to explain to President Putin that Russia will have to pay reparations to Ukraine for the damage they have caused, and also compensate the US for all of the military equipment that has been supplied. Every day the war drags on, the larger the bill Russia will have to pay to the US, and so it will be in Russia's interest to stop fighting. And oh, by the way, if you don't have the cash, we are prepared to accept 50% of your rare earth minerals, which Russia has in far greater quantity than Ukraine. Now, what's wrong with a politician saying something like that? That's a practical suggestion that even the most ardent Trump supporter, and the man himself, could not seriously be offended by. If there isn't sufficient pushback from countries such as Australia, Trump and his MAGA successors might start to believe that all of this is perfectly acceptable. What if Trump says to Australia, if you want our security support to continue, we want 50% of your iron ore. What next? Every year we want you to send 1,000 of your beautiful women for our presidential harem? Give us all of your church silver? Imagine the worst-case scenario. Trump backs Putin, Europe completely fails to deliver, and Ukraine is conquered with hundreds of thousands more killed and the entire population enslaved. To what extent will the pious hand-wringing of our so-called leaders be remembered for then? I don't know about you, but in a genuine crisis, and make no mistake, this is a crisis, I want my leaders to respond and do the right thing. There are presumably some people in the Trump administration who know that their president is on the wrong path. Opinion polls in the US show that more than 80% of people think Putin is untrustworthy, with only 9% agreeing that he is. Australia is in a good position to contribute a small amount of moral leadership. So some people can say, look, even the Australians don't think this is a good idea. It's not as if any Australian lives are at risk from doing the right thing. It's the Ukrainians who are doing the fighting and dying. And even if the most mild-mannered criticism sends Trump into a fury, so be it, because we have more than 3 years of this to go, and the situation could actually be permanent. Which reminds me, on a lighter note, why do Australian politicians hide behind hypothetical questions, or not answering hypothetical questions? In life, we get hypotheticals all the time. What would you do if you won Tatslotto? What would you do if you discovered your partner was actually from a different planet? So why can't Albanese and Miles respond honestly to a question such as, if the US requested Australian involvement for the invasion of Greenland or Panama, how would we respond? Surely the obvious answer is to very politely say Australia wouldn't do it because A, it's not in our national interest, and B, it would seem to be against international law. If the Trump administration is offended by that, well, that's just too bad. If you had a friend or relative who started answering questions like, what are you doing tomorrow if it rains, with, I'm not going to answer a hypothetical, surely you would seek some sort of medical intervention and request that they get help. My own suspicion, by the way, is that the reaction of the Trump administration would be the opposite, a bit of respect for a country that can very politely disagree while still being supportive of the relationship. And speaking of AUKUS, the statements of Trump surely undermine the confidence of all US allies in any security agreements that are in place. The UK, for example, has already reacted by indicating that AUKUS is no longer a priority, they're out of the Indo-Pacific, and that they are going to focus all of their security attention on NATO and Europe. So there you go, for somehow this incredibly naive belief that the UK was going to help us out. The US president has basically said that military support will only be given if it suits the US, and unless there's something in it for them, they won't lift a finger. As I say, Europe has been in uproar for a week, but here it's only received a small amount of coverage because many of my fellow journalists continue to waste everyone's time in asking the Prime Minister over and over and over for the date of the next federal election. But bluntly, the message from Trump to the rest of the world is, you are on your own unless there's something in it for us. At least I suppose he's being honest. I guess I've always been worried by the sort of doe-eyed hero worshipping of the United States by our politicians in senior defence ranks. I've always thought that we have been over-reliant on the United States for our security, and now it seems to be all falling into place in a bad way. Oh, and I noticed that Trump has just purged the top ranks of the military, sacking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because of the colour of his skin, and the Chief of Navy because she's a woman. Anyway, back to AUKUS. If it were me, I'd say to the US, if you abandon Ukraine to their fate, we will assume you will do the same to us. In the light of that, we will not pay a single cent more on AUKUS until you can show that you are a steadfast ally. Of course, no one in this government, or let alone in defence, would ever dare such a thing, because frankly they are completely spineless. Here's a further thought. What if Trump wants something from President Xi and says, OK, sure, have Taiwan. South China Sea, yeah, we agree it all belongs to you. Philippines, no more military support. And once again, don't think it couldn't happen. That would be incredibly naive. Anyway, so let's do things in a practical way that shouldn't offend anyone, not even in the US. AUKUS Pillar 1. Vice Admiral Meade and the government have consistently said that we will receive second-hand submarines that are about 15 years old. That already narrows it down quite a bit because they are being built at a rate of slightly more than one per year. Since the first of these clunkers is due to be delivered in 2032, supposedly after refit, simple maths tells us that if the submarine is 15 years old, it, at that point, must have been commissioned in 2017. I can't see any fault in that logic. And I would dearly like to know from the government which one we are getting. Will it be Colorado, the Virginia submarine Colorado, SSN 788, commissioned on the 17th of March 2018, the one that would seem to be in the sweet spot, Washington, SSN 787, commissioned 7th of October 2017, a bit older, Illinois, SSN 786, commissioned on the 29th of October 2016. So we can narrow it down, I would have thought, to 3 submarines, and I wonder if Vice Admiral Meade and his team are even aware of these dates. But given that a major refit takes a submarine out of service for 2 years, the US would know right now when they are all due for their major overhauls. And if the US is unable to tell us today which submarine we are getting, the alarm bells would be really ringing for me. So we've got the UK already reorienting their strategy, the United States totally unpredictable and unreliable. Just a bit more on submarines for a moment. No one has ever been able to explain to me why the first 2 Virginia class that we are supposedly getting are second-hand, not new. There is no logic to it. When you buy an F-35 or anything like that, you aren't given a second-hand one to start with. And I believe the real reason is that a couple of senators on the US Armed Services, the Senate Armed Services Committee, jacked up when they were first briefed on AUKUS and said there's no way these Aussies are going to deprive the USN of new submarines. Now, it would be great if Vice Admiral Meade and the government could actually admit that that was true. We give the US gigantic amounts of money so they can build new submarines from themselves, and they give us old junk. Doesn't sound like a very smart deal to me. And just a further thought on that, going by quality of people from the Australian Submarine Agency that I've seen during things like Senate estimates hearings, I don't think there was ever any negotiation with the United States. I have the firm impression that it was just our people falling over themselves, agreeing to anything at all, just as long as they got some sort of deal done. I would love to be proven wrong on that, but the way that events are unfolding, not only will we no longer get these second-hand submarines, but with the British changing direction, I wonder what's going to happen to the AUKUS nuclear submarine that the British are meant to be building for us in the 2030s. Unless there's a major switch back in the other direction, I don't think we're going to get anything from them either. And it's time for people, politicians in particular, to start admitting the truth of the situation rather than deluding themselves and the Australian public. All of this can just happily go on forever. Now, the other security event that has enormous consequences for Australian security, and again, I don't like being hyperbolic, but it really does, and that is the huge topic of 3 Chinese ships, People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, 2 warships and a supply ship conducting live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea. I've been saying for a number of years that this sort of development was inevitable as the Chinese Navy grew in size and capability, though to be fair, I wasn't actually expecting such obvious displays of force until about 2030, when the Chinese Navy will be even more numerous and powerful than it is today. Now, as a Canberra Bubble person, I was, of course, watching Insiders on Sunday morning and was dismayed when one of the panel said words to the effect of, well, if we did this to China, the reaction would be much harsher. Well, here's the scoop. We have been doing it to China since 1949. Well, by we, I mean principally the United States, supported by allies such as Australia. And so I thought it was only a matter of time before China started behaving in exactly the same way. And with the United States, I've said to many of my friends and colleagues there, your behaviour of China will sooner or later be mirrored by China sailing one of their carrier battle groups down the entire west coast, starting in Seattle and finishing up somewhere off San Diego. And here I'm going to invite a bit of controversy. I've raised this topic in the past, and I seem to be in a minority here, but I have never been that keen on Australia participating or undertaking freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. First of all, in the big picture, if China ever wanted to cut off trade with Australia, they wouldn't have to do it militarily in the South China Sea. They'd just stop buying our stuff. And this idea that the South China Sea has to be kept open for all nations to use, well, you don't actually have to go through the South China Sea to get to places like Japan and South Korea. You can take a slightly longer route east of the Philippines. Doesn't seem to occur to too many defence planners. And my own view is that if there's a good reason for Australian assets to be in the area, like if they're transiting for a military exercise, or if it's to do with sanctions on North Korea, or if they're undertaking a series of port visits, all well and good. But if they're doing it to show to the Chinese who is boss, then I think that is wrong and counterproductive, and that has contributed to the situation now. And I'd invite people to reflect on the very poor state of the Royal Australian Navy. I've spoken about this so often. It is in decline. And as surely as night follows day, I believe that next time China might send two groups of ships, one to the Tasman Sea and one coming down the Indian Ocean coast, and the RAN will not be able to shadow them. Next year, the first of our air warfare destroyers goes into a 2-year refit, meaning we have 2 of those left. We may lose another Anzac frigate. They're being worked to death, which leaves us with an insignificant number of surface ships to undertake these sorts of tasks. And I really believe that this near obsession that Australian planners have had with being able to conduct extended operations in the South China Sea is now exposed as total folly. We do not need to be in the South China Sea. We need to be concerned about Chinese naval assets in the Tasman Sea, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and in the Indian Ocean. In my opinion, this requires a fundamental rethink of Australia's defence priorities. We have to realise that we are potentially on our own. We have to start planning for that, and we also have to budget for it. We need to look at an increase in defence expenditure now, not some sort of remote promise that it's going to happen from 2028 onwards. The situation, honestly, is dire, and it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. Sorry to be finishing on such an alarmist note, but I haven't seen a week anything like the one that we've just been through. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.